In the icy wilderness of the Arctic, life is a relentless battle between survival and nature's fury. Amid the blinding white expanse, a fragile polar bear cub staggered alone, each tiny step dragging her closer to exhaustion. Her breath came in rapid puffs, visible against the frigid air, as her weak body trembled with the cold. Somewhere out there, her mother was gone, lost to the unforgiving hunt or claimed by the merciless jaws of fate. She was too young to understand the full scope of her loneliness, but the sharp pang of hunger gnawed at her belly, an inescapable reminder that time was running out. Stay tuned, subscribe to Wildlife Legends now and join us on this heart-stopping journey of survival, courage, and miracles. The cub's glassy eyes reflected the glimmering twilight as the Arctic wind howled like a ravenous predator. The temperature plummeted below freezing, turning even her soft fur into a thin, frost-coated shield. She whimpered, a sound swallowed by the storm, and took another shaky step, until her paw slipped on a hidden patch of ice. She tumbled hard, landing with a soft thud, her tiny frame splayed against the cold surface. The biting chill seeped deeper into her bones, threatening to steal what little warmth she had left. Miles away, a man trudged through the snow, his heavy boots crunching with each step. His name was Ethan Gray, a seasoned Arctic researcher drawn to the polar region's mysteries and a quiet love for its silent beauty. But today, his mission was different. Reports of rapid ice melt and vanishing wildlife had driven him into this desolate wilderness with a heavy heart. He carried with him not just instruments and cameras, but a personal mission, to witness and, if fate allowed, to help. His eyes scanned the horizon, a sharp contrast of determination against the soft grays and whites of the landscape. As he moved, something strange caught his attention, a lone silhouette limping in the distance. His breath hitched as he squinted into the blizzard, the faint outline of the tiny figure barely discernible. It was moving. His heart thundered. Polar bears were rare here, and cubs alone? Nearly impossible. His instincts fired before thought could catch up, his hand clutched his radio, his voice urgent but calm. "I see something, a cub, I think. It's alone." He broke into a run, the icy wind biting his exposed skin, but he didn't care. Every second mattered. Each moment could mean the difference between life and death. His mind raced. Where was its mother? Was it injured? He pushed the questions aside. First, he had to reach her. The cub, exhausted beyond her tiny limits, had stopped moving altogether. Her small chest rose and fell, each breath shallower than the last. Snow clung to her fur, and her eyes began to close as though surrendering to the deep, cold sleep of eternity. She didn't see him. She didn't hear his footsteps thunder toward her. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, his breath caught in his throat as he beheld her fragile form. Her fur was coated in frost, and her paws were raw from the ice. For a split second, their eyes met, her gaze unfocused, weak, yet filled with the pure, innocent fear of the wild. He reached out, his gloved hand trembling, and carefully cupped her small body. "She's freezing," he whispered into the radio. "She won't make it unless..." He stopped, a wave of emotion choking his voice. Desperation turned to resolve. Without another word, he wrapped her in his heavy jacket, cradling her close to his chest. He could feel the faintest heartbeat, a flicker of life so fragile, it seemed the wind itself might snuff it out. He began the long, perilous trek back to his cabin, each step a battle against the storm. He moved slowly, cautiously, his arms a protective fortress around the tiny life clinging to existence. His mind swirled with thoughts. Was she abandoned? Injured? How long had she been alone? The questions would have to wait. The storm intensified as Ethan pressed forward, each gust of wind lashing at his exposed face with icy daggers. His arms tightened around the fragile cub nestled inside his coat, her body barely warm against the numbing cold. Every instinct in his body told him to hurry, but haste would be deadly on the treacherous terrain. He had to stay calm, focused, every step mattered. The Arctic was no place for weakness or error. The snowdrifts could swallow a man whole, the thin ice cracking with deceptive silence beneath unsuspecting feet. He knew the dangers well. But this time, it wasn't just his life on the line. He carried hope, fragile, breathing hope, in the form of a dying cub. Memories of another storm, long ago, surfaced in his mind. Ethan had been a rookie researcher then, full of ambition but green with inexperience. He had failed to save an injured fox caught in a trap. The image of the small, broken creature haunted him still. Not this time, he thought fiercely. This time, I'll make it right. The cub stirred weakly, a soft whimper escaping her frostbitten muzzle. Ethan felt the sound more than heard it, like a whisper in the dark. His heart clenched painfully. He glanced down, meeting her eyes again, and saw the flicker of life still burning inside her. A surge of emotion overwhelmed him, protectiveness, fear, and a fierce, unrelenting determination. "It's okay, little one," he whispered, his breath misting in the frigid air. "You're going to be okay. I've got you." The words were for her, but they echoed in his own heart, a promise as much to himself as to the tiny life cradled in his arms. Time stretched endlessly as he made his way toward the small outpost he had called home for the last 2 winters. The cabin was a sturdy structure, built to withstand the worst the Arctic could throw at it, but it felt a world away in this moment. His legs burned with exertion. The weight of his mission, of this helpless creature's fate, pressed down harder than the storm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the outline of the cabin emerged from the white chaos. Relief surged through him, but he didn't dare relax. Reaching safety was just the beginning. He kicked the door open with his boot, the force sending a spray of snow into the dimly lit interior. Warmth flooded over him as he stumbled inside, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. Without a second's hesitation, he laid the cub down gently on a thick blanket near the stove. The heat from the fire was a blessing, a gentle contrast to the deathly cold outside. Ethan's hands shook as he peeled off his gloves and coat, his fingers nearly numb. He knelt beside the cub, his breath hitching as he examined her more closely. Her fur, once pristine white, was matted with frost. Her tiny paws were raw, the pads cracked from exposure. He placed his hand lightly on her chest, feeling the faintest thrum of her heart, a fragile rhythm fighting against the inevitable pull of the cold. "Come on," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Stay with me." He retrieved a small, soft cloth from a nearby cupboard, dipping it into warm water before gently wiping the frost from her fur. She flinched at first, a weak protest, but he continued with tender care. Every touch was deliberate, every movement infused with a quiet reverence for the life he was fighting to save. For long moments, the only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire and the soft, rhythmic strokes of cloth against fur. Time slowed, each second stretched taut with tension. He worked tirelessly, refusing to let despair take hold. And then, a miracle. A small, trembling breath filled her lungs, stronger than the last. Her eyes, half-lidded and clouded with exhaustion, fluttered open. She blinked slowly, her gaze locking onto his with a clarity that hadn't been there before. Ethan felt his heart leap. "That's it," he whispered. "Good girl. That's it." The cub made a soft, pitiful sound, a sound that carried with it the weight of her struggle, her fear, and the fragile spark of hope. It was the sound of life. Ethan stayed by the cub's side through the night, watching over her like a sentinel guarding a precious secret. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting warm shadows that danced on the walls of the small cabin. Outside, the storm continued to rage, its fury muffled by the thick wooden planks and double-paned windows. But here, in this fragile bubble of warmth and safety, a quiet miracle was unfolding. The cub had begun to stir more frequently, her breaths deeper, steadier. She whimpered occasionally, a soft, broken sound that tugged at Ethan's heartstrings. He whispered words of comfort, knowing full well she didn't understand them, but perhaps, in some way, she felt their meaning. "You're a fighter," he murmured. "A little warrior. We're going to get through this." At some point, exhaustion claimed him. His head slumped against the edge of the couch, his body finally giving in to the weariness of the day. Sleep came in snatches, haunted by fleeting dreams of cracking ice and unseen dangers lurking in the blizzard. When he woke, the first thing he noticed was the absence of the storm's howling. A heavy, suffocating silence had taken its place, the kind that follows after a battle between man and nature has been fought and won. He rubbed his eyes and turned his gaze to the cub, his pulse quickening with a familiar mix of hope and dread. She was watching him. Her eyes, deep, dark pools of innocence and untamed instinct, met his with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. They held a question, unspoken yet piercing: why? Why am I still here? For a moment, time seemed to stop. Ethan felt the enormity of that gaze, the raw power of a connection forged in the crucible of survival. He had saved her life, but now what? What did it mean to intervene in the natural order of things? He reached out slowly, carefully, his hand hovering just above her head. She flinched but didn't pull away. He let his fingers graze the soft fur between her ears, a tentative touch that carried more weight than any words ever could. She was warm now, her heartbeat strong and steady beneath his hand. "There we go," he whispered. "You're going to be okay." She blinked, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed almost deliberate. Trust. A fragile, tenuous thing born of shared vulnerability. As the morning light began to filter through the frost-covered windows, Ethan rose and began preparing a makeshift meal. He knew little about caring for a polar bear cub. His expertise lay in research, not rescue. But instincts born of countless hours in the field guided him now. He warmed a mixture of goat's milk and fish oil, carefully pouring it into a shallow dish. When he placed it near the cub, she sniffed hesitantly, her nose twitching as she processed the unfamiliar scent. Hunger, an undeniable force, drove her to lap at the liquid. She drank slowly at first, her movements clumsy and weak, but with each sip, strength returned to her limbs. Ethan watched, a deep sense of wonder blooming in his chest. Life was fragile, yes, but it was also astonishingly resilient. As the hours passed, the bond between them grew. The cub began to move more, her paws testing the limits of her newfound energy. She explored the edges of the blanket, her tiny claws scraping against the wooden floor. She was curious, cautious, but undeniably alive. And with that life came a name. Ethan smiled to himself as he watched her stumble and right herself. "Mira," he whispered. "That's what I'll call you. Mira. A little miracle." The day passed in a delicate balance of care and watchfulness. The storm outside had finally relented, leaving a heavy, pristine silence over the frozen expanse of the Arctic. Snow dunes gleamed under the pale light, their curves shaped by relentless winds that had now vanished into memory. But Ethan knew that nature's calm was never a promise of peace, it was a reprieve, nothing more. Inside the cabin, warmth and life pushed back against the encroaching cold. Mira, the cub whose life had hung so perilously in the balance, now moved with a growing confidence. She was still weak, her steps uncertain, but there was a flicker of strength behind her dark eyes, a defiance against the forces that had tried to claim her. Ethan knelt beside her again, his hands steady and gentle as he rubbed warmth into her soft fur. His gaze lingered on her tiny frame, the fragile form that had survived against impossible odds. She was a symbol of so many things: innocence, resilience, and the desperate beauty of a world on the brink. But as his fingers traced the fine hairs of her coat, his mind turned to darker thoughts. The ice was melting faster than ever before. Glaciers that had stood for millennia were now vanishing, their ancient strength reduced to fleeting memories of snow and water. He had seen the charts, read the reports. Every projection pointed to one inevitable truth: time was running out. How many cubs like Mira had perished before anyone could reach them? How many more would be lost? A pang of helplessness pierced his chest, but he pushed it aside. He had her now. That was what mattered. As the hours stretched on, Mira grew bolder. She tottered across the floor, her paws slipping occasionally on the smooth wooden surface, but she pressed forward with the stubborn determination of the wild. Ethan couldn't help but chuckle at her tiny grunts of effort, a sound both fierce and endearing. "You're a fighter," he said softly. "A true survivor." The bond between them deepened with each passing moment, a connection built not on language but on trust, forged in the fire of shared vulnerability. Mira was learning to trust the warmth of his hand, the safety of his presence. And Ethan was learning something, too. He was learning that life wasn't measured solely in the moments that tested us but also in the quiet victories that followed. That evening, as twilight draped the sky in hues of gray and silver, he prepared a small bed for Mira near the stove. She settled into the soft pile of blankets with a sigh that seemed almost human in its relief. Ethan watched her eyelids flutter closed, the rhythm of her breathing steady and calm. But peace was fleeting in this place, as thin and fragile as the ice itself. A noise shattered the silence, sharp, sudden, and unmistakable. Ethan's heart leapt as he turned toward the window, his pulse thundering in his ears. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle propped against the wall. The sound came again, closer this time. A low, resonant growl that rumbled through the frozen air like the voice of the wilderness itself. He crept to the window, peering into the gathering darkness. The moon cast a ghostly glow over the snow, illuminating the silhouette of a massive figure moving just beyond the cabin's edge. A polar bear. The sheer size of the bear outside the cabin stole Ethan's breath. It moved with the fluid grace of a predator born to command the Arctic wilderness. Muscles rippled beneath its thick white coat as it prowled along the edge of the snowbank, the moonlight catching in its eyes that gleamed with a primal hunger. Ethan gripped the rifle tighter, the cold steel a sobering reminder of what might be necessary. His heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat of fear and adrenaline. But his mind remained sharp, calculating. He had studied polar bears for years. He knew their habits, their instincts. And he also knew that desperation drove even the most cautious creatures into dangerous proximity with humans. The bear sniffed the air, its massive paws leaving deep impressions in the snow. It was searching for food. The bitter wind had dulled its senses, but hunger sharpened its resolve. Inside the cabin, Mira stirred, a soft, vulnerable sound escaping her throat. Ethan turned, his breath catching as he saw her small form huddled near the stove. She was oblivious to the danger just beyond the walls, her tiny paws curling into the warmth of the blankets. The bear growled again, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the frozen ground. It was moving closer. Ethan's mind raced. A shot might scare it off, but it could also provoke an attack. And killing it, no, that wasn't an option. He had dedicated his life to studying and protecting these creatures, not destroying them. Yet, he couldn't risk Mira's life, or his own. The bear reared up suddenly, its massive frame towering over the snowbank. Its breath formed clouds in the icy air as it bared its teeth, a terrifying reminder of the raw, unbridled power of the wild. Ethan felt the weight of every decision he had ever made bearing down on him. He had chosen this life, the isolation, the danger, the constant dance with forces far greater than himself. And now, in this singular moment, every choice, every instinct, would be tested. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving the bear. He reached into a crate near the door, his fingers closing around a flare gun. It was a last resort, a bright, blinding light meant to drive back even the fiercest predators. With a deep breath, he flung open the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow, searing his lungs with icy fire. Snow swirled around his feet as he stepped onto the threshold, the barrel of the flare gun aimed into the darkness. The bear's eyes met his, a silent challenge hanging between them, man and beast, survival against survival. Ethan fired. The flare burst into life, a streak of crimson light that arced through the night sky. The bear roared, a sound that shook the very ground beneath them, before turning and lumbering away into the shadows. Its massive form faded into the distance, swallowed by the wilderness from which it had come. For a long moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that follows the passing of something ancient and mighty. Ethan's hands trembled as he lowered the flare gun. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one a reminder that he was still alive. Behind him, Mira whimpered softly, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. He turned to her, his heart aching with the weight of what had just transpired. She had come so close to death, closer than any living thing should have to endure. He knelt beside her, his voice a soft, trembling whisper. "It's over. You're safe." But as he spoke those words, a new realization settled over him, one that chilled him more than the cold ever could. Out here, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, there was no such thing as truly safe. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the frozen horizon, painting the snow in hues of gold and fire. Inside the cabin, a heavy stillness lingered, a quiet aftermath of the battle between man and wilderness. Ethan sat beside the sleeping cub, his eyes bloodshot, his body weighed down with exhaustion. Mira stirred, her small form rising and falling with the rhythm of her breath. She stretched her paws, blinking drowsily at the light that filtered through the frost-rimed window. Her eyes, dark and innocent, found Ethan's, and in that gaze, he saw something unspoken but profound: gratitude, trust, and the undeniable will to live. He smiled faintly, brushing his fingers across her soft fur. "You're one tough little girl," he murmured. The events of the night hung heavily in his mind. The bear's roar still echoed in his ears, a reminder of how close danger had come. His chest tightened with the weight of responsibility. He had saved her life, but now he faced a question that gnawed at his conscience. What happens next? Mira was no ordinary cub. She wasn't a pet, nor a companion that could remain by his side. She belonged to the wild, to a world vast and untamed, a world that was changing, melting, and slipping away. He stood, his legs stiff and aching, and moved toward the window. Outside, the Arctic stretched endlessly, its beauty both savage and fragile. Snow-covered plains gleamed under the rising sun, their pristine surface hiding the cracks and dangers that lay beneath. The ice was thinner this year, thinner than ever before. Climate change had left its mark, an invisible scar on the face of the wilderness. He thought of the mother bear that would never return, the cubs that wouldn't survive, and the world that was shrinking with each passing season. His jaw tightened. He had always believed in the power of science, in the idea that knowledge could drive change. But standing here, with the weight of life and loss in his arms, he felt the cold truth of how much had already been lost. He turned back to Mira, who now sat up, her eyes alight with curiosity. She batted at a stray thread of the blanket, her playful movements a reminder of the joy and innocence that still existed in the world, small, precious moments that defied the darkness. A decision took shape in his mind. He would fight for her kind, for the ice that held the stories of countless generations. He would share her story, not as a tale of survival alone, but as a call to action, a reminder that miracles, no matter how small, were worth fighting for. Gently, he gathered Mira into his arms, her warmth a defiant spark against the cold. He opened the door and stepped outside, his breath turning to mist in the frigid air. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow. He set Mira down gently, watching as her tiny paws pressed into the whiteness beneath her. She stumbled forward, her nose twitching as she inhaled the scent of the wild. Her world. Ethan knelt beside her, his heart full with the weight of love and letting go. "You belong here," he whispered. "But I'll make sure the world remembers you. I'll make sure they fight for you, for the ice, for everything worth saving." Mira turned, her dark eyes meeting his one last time. A connection born in the crucible of survival now stretched across a vast, unseen distance, man and bear, bound by fate, separated by destiny. As she toddled forward, her small form disappearing into the endless Arctic, Ethan stood silently, his breath steady, his resolve unshakable. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a fight that would shape the future. A fight for miracles. A fight for hope. A fight for the ice that held the soul of the earth.